The morning began like any other on the frontier, with the sound of wind brushing through the mesquite trees and the faint cry of a hawk above the cliffs. Clara Weston rose before the sun, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders as she stepped out of the trading post. The desert stretched endlessly before her, painted in ghostly grays and silvers. Her husband had been gone for 3 days, riding east to barter for supplies, leaving her and the 2 stable boys to guard the outpost. She told herself he would return soon. He always did, but that morning something felt wrong. The horses were restless, stamping at the dirt, their ears twitching toward the horizon. The silence was heavy, too heavy. Clara lifted a hand to shield her eyes from the sun creeping over the mountains. That was when she saw them, dark shapes moving fast across the sand. At first she thought it was a dust storm. Then the glint of sunlight flashed off rifles and her heart lurched. "Apache!" Someone shouted from behind the corrals, the air filled with chaos. The shriek of horses, the crack of gunfire, the terrified cries of men. Clara ran for the door, skirts snagging on splintered wood, but a figure on horseback swept past, snatching the rifle from her grasp before she could fire. She stumbled backward, falling hard, her ears ringing from the sound of war cries splitting the morning. When the dust settled, the world was unrecognizable. Smoke curled from the burning stables. One of the stable boys lay still beside the well. Clara's hands trembled as she pressed them to the earth, whispering prayers that no one heard. She felt the cold edge of a blade touch her chin and flinched. "White woman," a low voice said. Deep, quiet, but commanding. She looked up. The man towering over her wore a necklace of carved bone and silver, his dark hair braided with a single eagle feather. His face was calm, unreadable, not filled with rage but something far colder. His eyes, black as midnight, studied her for a long moment before he gave a sharp order in Apache. 2 warriors dismounted, seized her arms, and tied her wrists behind her back. Clara was lifted onto a horse, her breath ragged, her heart hammering. Behind her, the Apache chief, Cowboy, mounted silently. He said nothing as the raiders turned south toward the canyons. They rode for hours beneath the unrelenting sun. The smell of smoke and blood clung to the wind. Clara's throat burned from thirst, but she dared not speak. Around her, the warriors laughed and shouted in their own tongue, victorious and wild. Yet Cowboy rode apart, carrying something cradled in one arm, a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. At first, Clara thought it was food or loot from the raid. Then she heard it, a thin, desperate wail, a baby's cry. She turned slightly in her saddle, her bound hands aching. Cowboy's face softened as he looked down at the bundle, murmuring something low in Apache. The infant only cried harder. The sound pierced through the desert air, sharp, heartbreaking. Hour after hour, the wailing continued. When the warriors stopped to rest, the baby's cries grew hoarse, desperate. Cowboy's sister, a young woman named Sani, tried to feed him with a leather pouch filled with goat's milk, but the child refused, his tiny fists clenched, his voice fading. Clara watched in silence, her chest tightening with a pain she thought she had buried forever. The memory of her own baby, lost to fever months ago. The same small gasps, the same helpless crying. She bit her lip to stop herself from weeping. That night, when the campfire burned low and the desert wind turned cold, the baby's cries began again, softer now, weaker. Clara lay on the ground, wrists still bound, unable to sleep. She could feel the grief in every sound the child made, and it tore at her heart. Finally, when Cowboy rose to pace beside the fire, his face shadowed with helpless anger, Clara found her voice, a small trembling, but clear. "Please," she whispered. "Let me try. I can help him." Cowboy turned, his dark eyes narrowing. "How?" Her throat tightened, but she spoke the words anyway. I can breastfeed him." The camp fell silent. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. The warriors exchanged uneasy glances. Cowboy stared at her as though trying to decide if she was mad. But the baby's weak sobs broke through again, and slowly, the chief nodded once. Clara's heart pounded as Sani untied her hands. The moment she held the crying infant in her arms, the desert faded away. The child latched on, his tiny hand gripping her shawl. And for the first time since dawn, the wailing stopped. The Apache chief said nothing. He only stood there in the firelight, watching the white prisoner cradle his son, and for the first time, his eyes were not cold, they were grateful. The desert wind whistled low through the canyons, carrying with it the scent of smoke and dust. The night was heavy and still except for the faint rhythmic sound of a baby's breathing. The same child who for days had done nothing but cry. Now nestled against Clara's chest, he slept. His little fist rested against the fabric of her torn dress, his cheek pressed to her heart. The hush that fell over the Apache camp was eerie, almost sacred. The warriors who had once glared at her with suspicion now sat around the dying fire, staring wordlessly at the sight before them, a white woman nursing the son of their chief. The baby's tiny breaths were the only sound for miles. Even the horses seemed to sense that something rare had taken place. Caithnay stood a few paces away, tall and still, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. The red glow traced the lines of weariness on his face, a man who had buried too many and carried too much. His wife had died giving birth to this very child, and though he had fought to keep the boy alive every night, the cries had reminded him of what he had lost. But now, seeing his son finally at peace in the arms of a captive, something inside him shifted. When the fire burned low, Clara felt the baby grow heavy with sleep. She lifted him gently and looked toward Caithnay, uncertain what to do. "He's resting," she said softly, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "He'll live." Caithnay's gaze flicked to her eyes, blue like the morning sky he had long since stopped believing in. He gave a short nod, then turned away without a word. Yet his silence was no longer cold. It was something deeper, heavier, like the first breath after a long storm. Sani, Caithnay's sister, came to sit beside Clara, her expression cautious but curious. She touched the baby's tiny hand and murmured in Apache, "Nadli, life comes again." Then she looked up and gave a faint smile. Clara managed one in return, though her body trembled from fatigue. She had no food, no rest, and barely any strength left, but she had done something that mattered. For the first time since her capture, she felt something other than fear. The next morning, when the sun rose in bands of gold over the cliffs, the baby stirred and began to whimper again. Clara, half asleep, cradled him to her breast, and the sound faded into soft sighs. Around her, the warriors whispered in their language. Some crossed themselves or spat into the dust, muttering that it was unnatural, that a white woman should not nurse an Apache child. But Caithnay silenced them with a single glance. His authority was law, and no one dared defy him. Later, as the camp prepared to move deeper into the canyons, Clara was given a small blanket for herself and a horse to ride, small gestures that told her she was no longer treated entirely as a prisoner. Caithnay rode near her, his son swaddled against his chest. When the baby began to fuss, Clara instinctively reached for him. Caithnay hesitated, then handed the boy over. Their hands brushed, a fleeting touch, rough skin against soft, but something unspoken passed between them. As the hours turned to days, the strange rhythm of their journey became almost familiar. When the baby cried, Caithnay brought him to Clara. When she tired, Sani offered water and a wordless smile. Yet not everyone approved. One night, a warrior named Tosawi, scarred and bitter, spat near Clara's feet and said in broken English, "White woman bring bad luck. Chief forget his people." Caithnay's eyes flashed, and in a heartbeat his knife was at the man's throat. "She saved my son," he growled. "You will honor that." Tosawi backed away, muttering, but the warning was clear. The woman who had fed the chief's child was under his protection. That night, Clara sat apart, holding the sleeping infant close while Caithnay tended the fire. She watched him, wondering what kind of man he truly was beneath the ferocity. There was strength in him, yes, but also a deep sorrow she could almost feel from across the flames. When their eyes met, he asked quietly, "Why do you help him?" "He is not your blood." Clara looked down at the child, running a finger along his small, round cheek. "Because no child deserves to cry for a mother who's gone," she whispered. "I know what that sounds like." Caithnay said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He understood loss, more than she could know. The baby slept peacefully between them, the silence heavy with things neither dared to say. For the first time, Clara realized she was not merely surviving among her captors. She was beginning to matter, to him, and perhaps to herself again. And Caithnay, fierce and untouchable, found that the woman he had captured might be the only person who could quiet not just his son's cries, but his own heart. The desert had a strange way of softening cruelty. Days turned into weeks, and the searing heat that once felt unbearable became a rhythm Clara had learned to live with. Each sunrise brought the same things: the cry of the hawk above the cliffs, the creak of leather saddles, the whisper of sand under hooves. But it also brought her something unexpected: a small pair of dark eyes that found her every morning, waiting to be held. Caithnay's son, the baby she now called Little Hawk in her heart, had begun to laugh. His cries had turned to coos, his body filling out, his cheeks rounding with health. The others noticed. They said the white woman carried a strange medicine in her milk, that the spirits had bound the child's life to hers. Some said it in awe, others in contempt. Caitlin, as always, said little, yet he watched everything. When he spoke to his warriors, his tone was unchanged and stern, commanding. But when he looked at Clara, there was a flicker of something else. Not weakness, not warmth exactly, but a question, a quiet wondering he never allowed himself to voice. Clara felt it too. Each time their paths crossed, when she handed him the child, or when he brought her a share of food without looking at her directly, the space between them hummed with something that frightened her more than captivity ever had. Still, she tried to remind herself of what she was, a prisoner. And yet, in small ways, the walls of that prison began to shift. Sani, Caithnay's sister, had started teaching her Apache words: water, fire, sleep, child. Clara learned quickly. The rhythm of the language came easily, as though the desert itself whispered the sounds into her ear. In return, Sani asked about the white people's ways, about books and marriage, and what it meant to live behind fences. Clara told her, though part of her didn't know anymore. The fences she had once thought safe now seemed like cages. The wild land around her, cruel and free, had begun to feel more honest than the world she'd come from. One evening, when the sun melted into the horizon and turned the canyons gold, Clara sat by the fire with the child sleeping against her. Caitlin approached quietly, his shadow falling long across the sand. "You care for him as your own," he said in his low, deliberate English. Clara looked up, startled by the rare sound of his voice. "He is easy to love." Caitlin nodded, glancing at the sleeping boy. "His mother, she died giving him life. I thought he would follow her. But you—" He paused, searching for the words. "You gave him her strength." Clara didn't know what to say. The compliment, if it was one, felt heavier than gold. "I only did what any woman would do," she murmured. "No," Caithnay said. "Not any woman. Not your kind." The word struck her like a slap, but not from anger. From truth. She knew what her people thought of his kind. She knew what he had seen of hers. And yet here they were, two souls bound by a baby who could not live without her. As the wind picked up, Caithnay took off the small turquoise pendant that hung around his neck, the last token of his wife, and pressed it into the baby's blanket. "His name is Tyanita," he said softly. "It means young hawk. He will grow strong." Then he looked at her again, eyes dark and unblinking, "and he will remember the woman who gave him life." That night Clara could not sleep. The firelight danced on the canyon walls, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Caithnay's face, the rough edges, the quiet pain, the strength that came not from pride but from survival. She realized she was beginning to see him not as her captor, but as a man, one who had lost and grieved, and yet still carried life forward. The thought frightened her, because in that moment, lying beside the child who was not hers, Clara knew something forbidden was taking root. It wasn't just the child who had found comfort in her arms. It was the father. And in the silence of the desert, under 1,000 watching stars, she began to wonder if her heart would ever truly belong to the world she came from again. The canyon was changing with the season. Nights cooler, winds sharper, the scent of rain hanging somewhere far beyond the red horizon. Clara had learned to listen to the desert's moods. She knew when the coyotes would sing, when the sky would break open with thunder, when Caithnay's tribe would move to higher ground. Every rhythm of their life had become part of her own heartbeat. She was no longer the trembling woman who had been dragged through the dust. Her skin was tanned and rough from sun and wind, her hands steady with work. She cooked with Sani, gathered berries with the other women, and mended clothing torn by travel. Yet no matter how familiar things became, one truth still hovered over her. She was not one of them. Some warriors had accepted her. They greeted her with nods, even smiles, when she passed with the baby on her hip. But others turned away, spitting into the dirt. One man muttered that the chief's mind had been bewitched, that the ghost of his dead wife would curse them all for allowing a white woman to feed her son. Cottonee heard the whispers, but he said nothing. He ruled by silence, and silence carried more weight than any words could. Still, Clara could feel the tension building, a tension that wrapped around her like the coming storm. That night, while the wind howled through the canyon, she sat by the fire with little Hawk sleeping in her lap. Sani joined her, setting down a pot of stew. "They speak foolishly," Sani said quietly. "My brother does what he must. The boy lives because of you, but there are men who do not forgive such things." Clara looked into the flames. "And you? Do you forgive it?" Sani smiled faintly. "You have a kind heart, white woman. You are not like the soldiers who burned our homes. You do not need my forgiveness." The words warmed Clara more than the fire. But before she could respond, the baby stirred, letting out a faint cry. Clara rocked him gently, humming a tune from her childhood. Soft, wordless, full of longing. Cottonee appeared out of the shadows, his step silent, his face carved with worry. "He wakes too soon," he said. "He's growing," Clara replied, smiling. "He dreams more now." Cottonee watched the child for a long moment, then looked at her. "You speak as his mother would have." Something in his voice made her chest tighten. The space between them was filled with the sound of wind and fire, alive, restless, intimate. For a breath, she forgot who she was supposed to be. She only saw him, not the warrior who had taken her from her home, but the man who would stand watch through the night to keep her and the baby safe. Then, from the dark ridge above them came a flicker of light, the unmistakable spark of a rifle. Cottonee's eyes narrowed. "White soldiers," he hissed. Chaos broke out. Warriors leapt to their feet, grabbing rifles, bows, and knives. The baby began to scream. Clara clutched him tight as bullets whined through the night. Smoke, fire, and shouting filled the canyon. Cottonee shouted orders in Apache, his voice cutting through the storm like thunder. "Hide," he told Clara, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a rock crevice. She stumbled, nearly falling, but he steadied her with a grip that burned like fire. "Stay until I come." She nodded, breathless, clutching the baby to her chest. She could hear the fight breaking around them, gunfire echoing off the canyon walls, men shouting, the cries of the wounded. She wanted to look, to run, to do something, but all she could do was hold the child and pray. Hours seemed to pass before the noise began to fade. The first light of dawn crept into the canyon, painting everything in shades of gray. Cottonee returned. Blood on his arm, soot streaked across his face, but alive. Clara rose to her feet, tears stinging her eyes. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for him. He shook his head. "It is nothing." But when she saw the dark stain spreading down his side, she stepped closer anyway. "Let me help you." He hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion. Then finally he nodded. Clara tore a strip of fabric from her dress and pressed it to his wound. His skin was hot beneath her fingers, his breath uneven. For a moment their eyes met, the battlefield forgotten. The world narrowed to the space between them. "You could have run," Cottonee said quietly, his voice thick. Clara looked down at the child sleeping in her arms. "I couldn't leave him." Cottonee's gaze softened, something rare, raw, almost reverent. "You are stronger than most warriors I know," he said. "And braver." Clara looked at him through the haze of dawn, her heart trembling. She didn't feel brave. She only felt alive. In that moment, standing between fire and morning, she realized that she was no longer a captive caught between two worlds. She was part of both, and belonging to neither had never felt so much like freedom. The days after the soldiers' attack passed in uneasy silence. The Apache camp had moved deeper into the canyon lands, hidden among towering red rocks and twisted pines. The tribe buried 2 of their own that week. Clara stood beside Sani, head bowed, the child in her arms. Though no one said it aloud, everyone knew the chief's choices, sparing the white woman, keeping her close, letting her raise his son, had divided his people. Cottonee had not spoken to her since the battle. He had taken to riding out before dawn, returning only when the sun began to fade. Each evening he sat apart from the fire, sharpening his knife, lost in thought. His silence stung worse than his words ever could. Clara told herself it was better that way. She had her duties, caring for little Hawk, helping Sonny with food, mending the wounded's clothing. Yet no matter how much she busied herself, her thoughts drifted to Caithness. She had bound his wounds during the fight, felt his heartbeat beneath her hands, seen the human beneath the legend. One night, she couldn't bear the distance anymore. The moon was bright as she walked to where he sat on a flat stone overlooking the valley. He didn't look up when she approached. His knife flashed silver in the moonlight. "You shouldn't be alone," she said softly. "I am never alone," he replied, eyes on the horizon. "The dead walk with me." She hesitated. "You lost friends in that attack." He finally looked at her. His eyes, dark and sharp, reflected the firelight from the camp below. "Not friends, brothers, sons. They died because the white soldiers found us." His voice hardened. "Because of you!" Clara's breath caught. The words struck deep, though part of her knew he didn't mean them the way they sounded. "I didn't ask them to come," she whispered. "I would have warned you if I could." Caithness's jaw tightened. For a long while he said nothing. Then he sighed, low and tired. "I know." Clara stepped closer. "Then why do you look at me as if I were one of them?" He sheathed his knife and rose to his full height, tall and broad-shouldered, his shadow falling over her. "Because I cannot look at you without seeing what I should not want." The words stole her breath. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The wind carried the smell of sage and smoke between them. Caithness turned away first. "Go back to the fire," he said roughly, but she didn't. She stood her ground. "I belong nowhere now," she said, her voice trembling. "Your people hate me. Mine would hang me for what I've done, but here, with him." She nodded toward the tent where little Hawk slept. "I feel I still have purpose. If you want me gone, tell me. I'll go." Caithness's hand clenched at his side. Then slowly he looked at her again. Not as a captive, not as a burden, but as the woman who had kept his son alive when even he could not. "You saved what is most precious to me," he said. "You stayed when you could have run. My people may not see it, but I do." He took a step closer, his voice softer now. "No harm will come to you while I breathe." The next morning he gathered the tribe beneath the great stone arch that marked their camp. Warriors, elders, women, and children assembled in wary silence. Clara stood off to the side, holding little Hawk, unsure what was happening. Caithness stepped forward, his face calm but resolute. "This woman," he said, motioning to her, "came to us as a captive. Yet she gave life to my son. She stayed through fire and blood. From this day no one will speak ill of her. She will remain under my protection until the child is grown." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Tosawi, the scarred warrior who despised her, spat into the dust. "You shame our dead with this softness, chief," he growled. "She is a white witch. Her kind kills us without mercy." Caithness's gaze turned to steel. "Then let my spirit answer for it. Her blood is protected. Her place is here." The camp fell silent. The law of the chief was final. That night, Clara sat beside the fire, little Hawk asleep against her chest. Across the flames, Caithness's eyes found hers. For the first time since her capture, she saw not anger or pity, but something far deeper. It was the look of a man who had chosen not just to protect her, but to bind her fate to his own. And in that silence, as the fire crackled and the desert stars turned overhead, Clara realized the truth. She was no longer merely surviving in this place. She belonged to it, to the tribe, to the child, and whether she wished it or not, to the Apache chief whose choice had just changed both their lives. Autumn settled gently across the canyons, turning the sky a deeper blue and softening the edge of the desert wind. The tribe's camp was alive with movement. Children chasing one another between the fires, women tanning hides, men returning with game from the hunt. Life had begun to return after so much loss, and among them, Clara had found her rhythm. She rose at dawn each day, wrapped little Hawk against her chest, and joined Sonny in the daily work, grinding corn, weaving baskets, teaching the children small words in English that made them giggle. The Apache women no longer turned away when she approached. Some even smiled, though shyly. Respect in their world was earned slowly, but she had earned it. Caithness watched from afar more often now. He had changed too. The harsh lines in his face had softened, though the weight of leadership still bore down on his shoulders. When he rode out, the warriors followed without question. When he spoke, they listened. But when he returned, his first glance was always toward Clara and his son. Their paths crossed often, and each time, the air seemed to thicken between them. One cool evening, Clara sat outside her small tent, the fire flickering low. Little Hawk, now crawling, had fallen asleep against her arm. She was humming softly when Caithney approached. His shadow stretched across the fire before his voice reached her. "He sleeps well," he said quietly. "He's strong," Clara replied. "You should be proud." Caithney sat beside her, silent for a long while. The desert night was calm. Only the rustle of wind and the far-off cry of a coyote filled the air. "You have given him what I could not," Caithney finally said. "Peace." Clara looked at him. "You give him strength," she said. "He'll grow knowing both." He met her gaze then, and something unspoken passed between them. Not gratitude, not duty, but the fragile start of understanding. The same kind that had once existed between husband and wife, before words and blood divided them. "Your people," Caithney said after a moment. "They would not forgive you for staying." Clara's heart clenched. "No," she admitted. "They would call me a traitor. A woman who lost her senses." She looked down, voice trembling. "But the truth is, I lost everything long before I came here. My home, my child, my faith in what I thought was good and right. Out here!" She glanced at the starlit sky. "I found something worth holding again." Caithney was quiet. Then softly he said, "You found us." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe I found myself." They sat in silence after that, the kind that felt more like companionship than distance. Caithney's gaze lingered on her, the flicker of firelight tracing her face, the gentleness in her movements, the quiet strength she carried. He had seen many kinds of courage in his life, but hers was the rarest. When she finally rose to put the child to bed, he reached out and stopped her, his calloused fingers brushing her wrist. She froze, her breath catching. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you could leave if you wished. I would send men to guide you safely to your people." She turned toward him, eyes wide. "Do you want me to go?" He looked away, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. Wanting and doing what is right are not the same. Her throat tightened. "And what do you think is right?" Caithney's gaze returned to hers, dark, conflicted, burning with everything he couldn't say. "I do not know anymore." The silence between them said what words could not. In that stillness, something ancient and dangerous stirred, a feeling neither could name, but both understood. Clara's heart beat wildly. She wanted to step back, to remind herself that he was her captor, that she was his prisoner. But every time she saw the way he looked at his son or how gently he spoke to her, that truth became harder to hold on to. The fire popped, startling them both. Clara gently freed her hand. "Good night, Caithney," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "Good night, white woman," he said softly. But there was no coldness in the words anymore. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind, her heart heavy and restless. Somewhere outside, Caithney kept watch, his silhouette outlined against the moonlit rocks. Two souls, one born of the desert, one cast into it, bound by a child and a silence that had begun to mean more than words ever could. In the still dark hours before dawn, Clara realized something terrifyingly beautiful. She no longer feared the Apache chief. She was beginning to love him. Winter had barely settled when the sound of distant thunder rolled through the canyons. But it wasn't thunder, it was hoofbeats, many of them. The Apache scouts returned breathless to camp that morning, their ponies lathered in sweat. "Blue coats," one of them rasped, "riding hard from the east." The moment the words left his mouth, the camp exploded into motion. Women gathered the children. Warriors armed themselves. Smoke signals rose into the cold sky, warning other bands scattered across the ridges. Clara felt the air change, the same way it had before a storm back home, heavy and waiting. She clutched Little Hawk close as Caithney barked orders, his voice calm but sharp. The fire in his eyes had returned, the one that belonged to a leader who had faced the U.S. Army before and survived. "How many?" he asked the scout. 30 riders. Cavalry uniforms. They carry a white flag." Caithney's jaw tightened. White flags can lie. Still, he rode out to meet them with 4 of his best men. Clara stood at the edge of the camp, watching him disappear into the distance, her chest tight with fear. Every sound and the crack of a twig, the cry of a hawk, made her heart jump. Hours passed before he returned. When he did, his expression was unreadable. "They say they come for peace." he told the gathered warriors. But peace has always been their word for surrender. He turned to Clara then. They asked for you. Her blood ran cold. Me? Katney nodded. They know there is a white woman here. They say you were taken from a settlement near Santa Rosa 2 years ago. Clara's heart pounded. She hadn't heard that name in so long it sounded like something from another life. Santa Rosa. My home, she whispered. They're from Fort Hamilton, then? Yes, Katney said quietly. They came under the command of Captain Dyer. At the sound of that name, Clara's knees almost gave out. Captain Dyer, her husband's commanding officer, the man who had sent Samuel, her husband, into the ambush that killed him. The man who had delivered her Samuel's blood-stained locket with no remorse. Katney saw the fear in her eyes and softened his tone. They claim they want to bring you home. Home. The word felt hollow now. Where was home? A town that had buried her name and left her for dead? Or this camp, this tribe, this place where a child smiled and called her mother in 2 languages? That night, Clara sat outside her tent long after everyone had gone to sleep. The wind howled low through the canyons, cold enough to sting her face. She didn't hear Katney approach until his shadow fell over her. You are troubled, he said. They want me back, she murmured. But I don't know if I belong there anymore. Katney crouched beside her. You are not a prisoner now, Clara. You have been free for many moons. She met his gaze. Am I? If I go, I lose what I found here. If I stay, I lose who I was. Katney looked into the fire. The woman you were is gone. The one before me. She is stronger. His words struck something deep inside her, a truth she hadn't dared to face. She had changed. The prairie girl who once feared the Apache now trusted one more than any man she had ever known. Suddenly a cry pierced the night. A young warrior ran toward them, shouting, Katney! The bluecoats moved closer. They crossed the ridge. Katney sprang to his feet, his hand going to his rifle. Wake the warriors, he ordered. Then to Clara, more gently, go inside. Stay with the boy. Clara's heart thudded. They said they came for peace. He gave her a grim smile. Peace comes after blood, not before. Before she could speak again, he was gone, vanishing into the shadows like a wraith of the desert. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She held Little Hawk tight, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. She prayed not for herself, but for the Apache chief who had risked everything to protect her. And when the first shots echoed through the canyon at dawn, she knew that her old life was no longer calling her home. Her heart belonged where the gunfire was. With him. The first gunshot shattered the stillness of dawn. Then came another and another until the air trembled with thunder. Clara jerked awake, Little Hawk crying in her arms as smoke drifted from the ridge. The battle had begun. Katney's warriors moved like shadows between the rocks, using the land as their shield. The cavalry had charged hard, their rifles flashing in the rising sun. But they were in Apache country now, rugged, unpredictable, alive. From the camp, Clara could hear the cries of men and the terrifying scream of horses. She crouched behind a line of boulders, clutching her child close, whispering, It's all right, baby. It's all right. But her voice trembled. She was lying, and she knew it. Sonny, the elder woman, appeared beside her, carrying a small blade and a pouch of herbs. If they reach the camp, she warned in a low voice, hide. Do not move, even if you hear our men fall. Clara's heart clenched. And Katney? Sonny looked toward the ridge where smoke curled skyward. He fights like the mountain lion. But even lions bleed. The words hit Clara harder than any bullet could. Hours passed like days. The gunfire echoed in bursts, then fell silent, then roared again. Clara's mind swung between terror and disbelief. How could this be happening? These soldiers claimed to bring peace, yet they rode with guns blazing. She thought of Captain Dyer, the man who had taken everything from her, now sending death again into her world. A lone rider suddenly broke through the haze. It was one of Katney's young warriors, his side soaked in blood. He dismounted roughly and stumbled toward the tents. They circle around. He gasped. From the east, they mean to burn the camp. Clara didn't think. She wrapped Little Hawk tightly in a blanket and ran. Smoke began to fill the canyon, thick and choking. Arrows whistled overhead, answering the crack of rifles. The world was fire and dust and screams. She ducked behind a fallen log, clutching her child against her heart. Clara, the voice cut through the chaos. Katney. He rode through the smoke on a black stallion, blood streaked across his arm, his face fierce and wild. When he saw her, something inside him broke. Relief, fury, fear all tangled in one breath. "Why are you not hidden?" he shouted, leaping from his horse. "I couldn't stay," she cried. "They're coming from the east." He glanced past her and cursed under his breath. "You're right. They split their men." Before she could speak again, a rifle cracked. The bullet struck the ground inches from her feet. Catanay threw himself over her, shielding her body with his own. Little Hawk wailed in her arms as dust filled her mouth and lungs. When the smoke cleared, Catanay was already up again, rifle raised. "Go back," he ordered. "Find the caves north of the stream. Sani will meet you there." "I won't leave you." He turned to her then, eyes blazing, not with command this time, but something rawer. "You must." "If they take you, they will kill the child." Another bullet whizzed past. Catanay fired back, hitting his mark. The soldier fell, tumbling into the brush. Clara hesitated only a moment longer before grabbing Little Hawk and running. Every breath burned. Every step felt like the last. Behind her, she could hear Catanay's war cry echoing through the canyon, a sound that froze her blood and made her heart ache all at once. She reached the stream just as smoke thickened the air, her legs trembling. Sani was there, waving her into the mouth of a hidden cave. "Quickly!" the woman hissed. Clara collapsed inside, clutching her son as the world outside burned. Hours passed in darkness. She could hear the fighting fade, then return, then fade again. At some point, exhaustion took her. When she awoke, the cave was silent. The air smelled of ash. Sani was gone. Fear clawed at her chest. She stepped out into the cold night, barefoot, carrying Little Hawk. The once living camp was now a grave of smoke and ruin. Bodies lay still beneath the moonlight. Horses wandered lost and riderless. And then, her eyes caught a shape by the rocks, Catanay. He lay on his side, his hand still gripping his rifle, blood staining the ground beneath him. Clara's heart broke open. She ran to him, fell to her knees, and pressed her trembling hands against his chest. "Catanay." "Please, no, no." His eyes fluttered open. Weak but alive. "Clara," he whispered. "You stayed." Tears streamed down her face as she cradled his head against her lap. "Of course I stayed. I'll never leave you again." The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of smoke and death. Yet beneath it all, Catanay's breathing steadied, shallow but steady. The battle was over. But nothing would ever be the same. Morning broke cold and gray over the smoldering ruins of the Apache camp. Smoke drifted upward in thin, ghostly spirals. What had once been a living village of laughter, fire, and song was now silent. Only the wind moved among the broken shelters. Clara sat beside Catanay, his head resting in her lap, while Little Hawk slept against her shoulder. Her hands were slick with his dried blood. She had pressed herbs into the wound on his side and bandaged it with torn strips from her skirt, praying the bleeding would stop. It finally had. Catanay's eyes opened slowly. His breath came shallow but steady. "How many?" he whispered. Clara swallowed hard. "I don't know. Some fled toward the mountains. The rest?" Her voice broke. "They're gone." Catanay closed his eyes, jaw tightening. "Then it is as I feared." He tried to rise, but pain forced him back down. Clara pressed a hand to his chest. "Don't move." "You need rest." He managed a faint, wry smile. "Warriors do not rest when their people are scattered, and mothers don't rest when their child has no home," she replied softly. Their eyes met, tired, hollow, but alive. Something passed between them then, a shared understanding that went beyond tribe or skin. They had both lost everything once. Now each was all the other had left. Before either could speak again, a sound broke the quiet, the crunch of boots. Clara froze. Catanay's hand went to his rifle, but his strength failed him. From behind a line of burned-out shelters, 3 men emerged, dressed in dusty blue uniforms. Cavalry. The leader stepped forward, his mustache gray, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. "Mrs. Dyer?" he called out cautiously. "Clara Dyer?" Clara's blood turned to ice. "I'm Captain Dyer," he continued. "We've been looking for you for months." For a moment she couldn't breathe. The man who had destroyed her life now stood before her, flanked by soldiers, surrounded by the ruin his peacekeeping had wrought. Catanay's hand trembled on his rifle. "This man," he rasped, "he is the one who led them?" Clara nodded slowly. Yes. Dyer's gaze flicked to Caithnay, then to the child in her arms. My God, that's an Apache child. He's my child, Clara said, her voice sharp and steady. The captain hesitated, studying her. Clara, you don't know what you're saying. You've been through hell. Come home. We'll take you back to Fort Hamilton. You'll be safe. Safe. The word sounded false on his tongue. Safe had meant lonely nights, a husband buried under cold soil, and a world that never once cared whether she lived or died. Caithnay stirred weakly beside her. Go, he whispered. If you stay, they will kill you too. Clara looked down at him, tears gathering in her eyes. No, she whispered. Not again. Clara, Dyer said firmly, taking a step forward. That's an order. Leave him. He's a savage. The word struck her like a blow. Something inside Clara hardened. She rose to her feet, holding Little Hawk tight. You call him a savage, she said, her voice trembling but clear. But he's shown me more kindness than any man wearing that uniform. Dyer's expression shifted. Pity, disbelief, disgust. You've gone native. No, she said. I've gone human. Caithnay tried to speak, but Clara knelt quickly beside him. Listen to me, she whispered. I'll find a way to keep you safe. I promise, he shook his head faintly. No, my place is here. With the land. His hand brushed the side of her face. Yours is wherever your heart beats. Her throat tightened. It beats for you. For a moment, time stopped. The wind, the fire, even the soldiers seemed to fade away. Caithnay looked at her as if trying to memorize her face, the shape of her lips, the sound of her breath. Then Dyer barked an order. 2 soldiers moved forward. Clara stood her ground. If you touch him, I'll scream. The world will hear what you've done here. The soldiers hesitated, uncertain. Dyer sighed heavily. Clara, you can't save him. You'll only die beside him. Then I'll die with him. Silence. Even Dyer seemed unsure what to do. Finally, he stepped back, gesturing for his men to lower their rifles. We're leaving, he muttered. Let her make her own damn choice. The soldiers turned and disappeared into the haze. Clara fell to her knees beside Caithnay, trembling. They're gone, she whispered. But Caithnay's eyes were closing again, his breath shallow. You chose, he murmured. Yes, she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. I chose you. And in that moment, amid smoke, ruin, and ash, the white woman and the Apache chief clung to one another, not as captor and captive, not as 2 from different worlds, but as 2 hearts that had found home in the most impossible place. The desert was quiet again. The gunfire was gone, the smoke had drifted away, and only the wind whispered through the canyon. 3 days had passed since the soldiers rode off, leaving Clara, Caithnay, and the remnants of a broken people behind. Caithnay's wound had begun to heal, though slowly. Clara never left his side. She fed him broth made from roots and herbs Sani had taught her to find, washed the dust from his face, and spoke softly to him through the long nights when the fever came and went. Sometimes he would wake and look at her, not with pain, but peace. Other times his lips would move in Apache prayer, a murmur that rose like smoke to the heavens. On the 4th morning, Caithnay opened his eyes fully. His voice was weak but steady. You still watch over me, he said. Clara smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his brow. You did the same for me once. I'm just returning what you gave. He looked past her then, toward the sunrise spreading across the canyon walls. The land lives. So do we. She followed his gaze. The desert that had been a place of war and pain now glowed with light, gold and crimson and endless. Life would go on, even after everything that had burned. By afternoon, the survivors began to return. The women who had fled with their children. The young warriors who had escaped through the canyons. Sani was among them, her eyes filled with tears when she saw Caithnay alive. They began to rebuild, quietly, solemnly. Clara helped them. She fetched water, carried stones, and sang to the children when they cried. No one called her outsider anymore. The tribe had seen her kneel beside their wounded chief. They had seen her stay when the others ran. By nightfall, the campfire burned again. Fewer than before, smaller than before, but alive. Clara sat beside Caithnay, Little Hawk asleep in her lap. The boy had started babbling new words, half Apache, half English. He laughed easily. untroubled by the war that had nearly ended them all. Cadenet watched his son with quiet pride. "He will belong to both worlds," he said. Clara nodded. "And maybe, because of him, those worlds will someday stop fighting." He was silent for a moment. Then he turned to her. "And you, Clara? Which world will you choose?" She looked at him for a long time before answering. "I thought I had to choose," she said softly. "But maybe I don't. Maybe home isn't a place, and maybe it's a person." Cadenet's eyes softened. "You would stay here among my people? Among the desert?" She smiled through tears. "The desert gave me back my life, and you gave me back my heart. I can't walk away from that." He reached for her hand then, strong, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "You were never my prisoner," he said. "You were the spirit who came to heal what I thought was lost." Clara leaned in and kissed his hand. "Then let me stay, Cadenet, as your equal, your wife, if your heart still wants me." For the first time since the war, Cadenet smiled, a real smile, quiet and full of light. "The land will bear witness," he said softly. "The sky will remember." That night, the tribe gathered around the fire. Sani began a low, haunting chant, a song of rebirth and union. Clara didn't know the words, but she felt their meaning deep inside her chest. Cadenet rose slowly to his feet, still weak, and took her hands. He looked into her eyes as if seeing her for the first time all over again. "You came to us in sorrow," he said, voice carrying across the circle. "You brought peace where there was none. You gave life to my son and courage to my people. From this day you are not white or Apache. You are of the earth as we are." Clara's eyes filled with tears. Around them, the tribe began to sing, a slow, rising melody that echoed against the canyon walls, carried by the wind like a promise. Little Hawk stirred in Sani's arms and reached toward them, laughing softly. Cadenet gathered his son into his arms, and Clara leaned into his side. The flames danced higher, painting their faces in gold and amber. In that moment, the war, the pain, the loss, all of it felt far away. What remained was love, fragile, hard-won, and eternal. As the song faded into the night, Clara closed her eyes and whispered into Cadenet's shoulder, "We survived." He kissed the top of her head and murmured, "No, we lived, and somewhere in the desert, where blood had once soaked the earth, the wind carried a new sound, the laughter of a child and the heartbeat of two souls who had found home in each other. The end